Here's a question. What's more fun and satisfying than running round full steam and nothing but power armour, blowing shit up and knocking the heads off super mutants with one punch? The answer is nothing. Absolutely nothing. What's up, YouTube? Guess who's back with a brand new 76 build guide? Well, I say brand new, but it's really a 2024 revamp of my original Juggernaut guide back in 2021, because the build has came a long way since then, and it's still the most unique build I have ever made and that I've ever seen. And despite me not actively playing the game for a long time, I have came back recently for a bit of PvE with a buddy who's just started the game, and I've basically not used any other build. I'm just so fucking in love with it. But considering the player base has massively expanded since the last guide, and probably since I've last been active in the game, thought it would be a good time to share this insane build with you all, this time in 4K. So if you're fed up with the same old bog standard, bloodied and full HP builds we've been seeing for years, and are looking for something super fun, super fresh, then this is the build for you. And I can assure you, this ain't your average melee build. Meet the Juggernaut. The explosive, dashing, skull-bashing powerhouse that's practically a mini-nuke on arms and legs. This is the most OP melee build ever. But before we get into all the specifics, here's a quick disclosure. So the build I'm showing you today is a true endgame build to be utilised at its full potential. So it may take time and a bit of grind to mould it like mine, but you can most certainly put together the framework for it, and it can be something to work towards. And although this is primarily a PvE build, it is relatively viable in PvP as well, albeit maybe not against some of your more experienced meta, quote unquote, PvPers, but it can definitely still hold its own, if not obliterate, but it absolutely rocks in any melee battle. That being said, I will link some old PvP videos in the description to check out what it's been capable of in the past, but let's be real, PvP is trash now anyway.
Why you PvP? PvP poopy.
Further to this, it will be a full in-depth guide to appeal to new players also, so please don't feel like I'm patronising. But that aside, let's break down the structure of the guide, because this will be a beefy video, but as always there will be timestamps down below for easy navigation. So section 1 will be the overview, what the build is about, and its premise. Section 2 will take a look at the ideal power armours and mods, because this is strictly a PA build, and then take a look at what weapons to use. Wait, there is no weapons. Section 3, the Perk Cards. We will look at my setups and discuss some alternatives as well that may fit your playstyle a bit better. And then Section 4, the Mutations, Chems and buffs, including foods. Let's get it. So the Juggernaut in essence is an unarmed power armour build that uses no weapons, only fists. Sounds crazy, but I did say it wasn't your average melee build. It's primarily a VATS build to take advantage of particular perk cards, but overall it is a literal pain train. It's a complete powerhouse that when combined with the right armour, perk cards and buffs can be practically invincible in PvE and do devastating damage at the same time. And as an example, if you look at some of the damage numbers in the footage, from normal attacks to solid clean VATS hits, you can hit for anything between about 400 to 1800 damage. Absolutely insane. You can take out most mobs in the game in 1 or 2 hits and obliterate groups of enemies as if they didn't even exist. There is also a lot of synergy to the build, so please pay close attention. When it comes to the power armour, of course we want to be as tanky as possible, but there is no particular perfect set for the build. You could run a non-legendary set if you like, but you will obviously benefit much more from the best legendary rolls, such as the sets I use. Now, I do have some top tier sets of armour, but the sets I showcase have been duped to the high heavens, so it shouldn't be too difficult to get your hands on the set that you want. And also, the power armour dupe is still currently active. Shh, don't tell Daddy Don I told you that. But moving on, your ideal prefix has to be Overeaters. It's the best effect which offers a flat damage reduction, and with all 5 pieces you'll have a maximum of 30% damage reduction, which quite frankly shits all over energy or damage resistance that you would get from vanguards or bolstering etc. The only caveat to this is you need to keep your food and water topped up, which you should be doing anyway for the additional HP and AP buffs, but food will play a big part in this build as well. The other main benefit of Overeaters is you can literally use it with any build type, bloodied, full HP, or 50-50, which is my main setup I'll be showing you today. As the second main perk, ideally you would want the good old classic Cavaliers, which offers a 75% chance to reduce damage while sprinting. For obvious reasons, this effect is best as most of the time you will be doing exactly that, as if you're the Big Lebowski's bowling ball heading for a horde of ghoul-shaped pins. Sentinels works pretty well also, which is when standing still, because you can find yourself quite often grounded and swarmed with mobs. But my particular set is actually a hybrid of 3 Cav and 2 Sentinel pieces to have the best of both worlds, but it is mainly all about the Overeaters. Also as a third role, the ultimate would be AP refresh, because this build is highly dependent on AP, mainly for VATs. Also, just to make my build extra spicy, I actually have this in Strangler. And for anyone that doesn't know what Strangler is, it's a unique acid-infused armour set that does area damage at close proximity and also some acid damage over time with attacks. And the plans for this are now only available for gold bullion, but it could be duped for you if you know where to look. For PvP, you would simply swap out the Overeaters for Assassins and Bob's your ante. However, when it comes to the mods for your armour, some are quite critical and can make or break the build. For the helmet, no mod is overly necessary, but if I could, I would have Target and HUD. The chest mod I use is what adds a really cheeky twist to my build, and that's the Tesla coils. These combined with the Strangler effect, Plague Walker mutation, and the simple fact that you're always up close and personal help make the build just that little bit more devastating. And not to mention, that's just really satisfying, zapping everything that comes close. Besides this, some may favour protocols, since we'll be running half health, but honestly, you don't really need them if your build is as tanky as mine, because you'll be proccing stims as soon as you hit 20% health anyway. But the next best choice would be Core Assembly for that AP regen, which would be my close second choice to coils. But to mix things up even more, on my PvP set, I actually use Kinetic Dynamo that reflects 50% of melee damage back to the attacker, which is a cheeky little number that. For the arms, we need Hydraulic Bracers, and this is the most important mod or the build just won't work. Plus 15 unarmed damage doesn't sound like much, but in tandem, it's the difference between doing fuck all damage and not doing fuck all damage, so you need those bracers. Then finally on the legs, I use Kinetic Servos, simply because it promotes that AP regen, which is very important, but you might be one of these people that's constantly cucumbered and may need to run calibrated shocks, so be it. But in an ideal world, carry weight should not be an issue with this build. Overdrive Servos doesn't stack with Speed Demon mutation, so they're useless, and that pretty much leaves optimised servos to reduce AP cost when sprinting. Do note as well that if you opt for any of these mods for Ultra Sight or Strangler, unfortunately they can't be bought and need to be either grinded from the Queen or traded for, but if you're an endgame player, you may well know these mods already. But that's it for the armour guys, now it's time for the juicy part. Let's talk perk cards. So with any build and card setup, there's always compromises and sacrifices to be made. So there is various combinations of cards I use for desired effects, either to min-max my build or to be more tankier. But ultimately, it's about finding something that works best for you and your playstyle. But I do believe overall that these are the best, most logical cards for the build. Also, don't be alarmed by some of the base stats because most of these are topped up with legendary specials, so let's have a swatch. So straight off the fist, we have max strength, 2 perception, 8 endurance, 7 charisma, 8 intelligence, 2 agility and 14 luck. Now, as we go through the cards, I will explain along the way, if necessary, my logic behind each card, albeit some are pretty obvious. But we will start with the legendary cards, because these are basically what makes this build tick. So first up we have Hack and Slash. This is the main card for the build, and what makes it so devastating. 50% chance for melee VATS attacks to do area damage. And with that, it means that you have a 50-50 chance to trigger an explosion. And it is that very explosive effect that we want to buff to do as much damage as possible. The explosion is also indirect damage, so it's this effect that works so well in PvP as it ignores the damage cap. Following this, the other main legendary card is Exploding Palm. 20% for unarmed weapons to trigger an explosion on attack hits, which works in and out of VATS. So if you think about it, sometimes we can have both Hack and Slash and Exploding Palm proc at the same time for even more devastating damage. So these two are pretty much what make this build. The other 4 cards are just special top-ups: Charisma, Endurance, Strength and Agility. But I do always say that, it doesn't matter what legendary specials you top up, as long as it's not specials that you don't need for the build. And with the legendary strength and the 15 base points, I actually have 20 base strength because we want to be boosting this as much as possible. The higher your strength means the more damage you'll do in melee, plain and simple. Now for the card deck. In strength, we have Travelling Pharmacy to reduce the weight of all chems, because I do run a lot, especially stims. Plus, it is a logical gap filler as well. Iron Fist, to add even more damage to our unarmed attacks, plus 20%. Pain Train. Now this is a great card for PvE and PvP, as it staggers enemies when running into them, and it makes them completely defenceless and open for attack for a few seconds. Blocker. Not overly necessary, but does help a lot to reduce damage considering the playstyle here. And lastly, Incisor, which is quite an important card to ignore 75% of the target's armour. In Perception, we have one very important card, and that's Grenadier, to double the radius of our explosions. With this, you will find yourself quite often taking out multiple mobs at the same time, which is pretty nice. With Endurance, we have a total of 13. The higher your endurance, the higher your max HP. Now, some of these cards are more personal preference and situational, but we can discuss the different options afterwards. However, my main setup looks like this. Chem Feed, rank 3. But I do have this at level 2 as well, and I'll explain why in a bit. But this makes your chems last longer. Lead Belly. So we don't take any rads from the food that we eat, or if you use nukas, which I do sometimes, especially for PvP. But an option for this could be to drop it when you don't need it for something else. So for example, have it on when you're eating your food buffs, then swap it out for something else, but it could be real tedious if you forget to do this, so I tend just to leave it on. Solar Powered. Now this is one of those situational cards that only works during the day for 3 extra strength, because remember, it's all about that strength. But again, who really keeps track of the time, so I tend to just leave it on. Fireproof, which isn't overly necessary in most cases, but if you do become victim to any explosions, you may very well regret not having it on. This is more critical when it comes to PvP. Lastly, one of the most important cards in the build, and that's Radical. That gives you up to an extra 5 strength the higher your rads. And believe it or not, when you hit somewhere between 40 and 50% rads, you get the max buff from this. I can only imagine that some people think this only works at low health, but this is not the case, my friends. So that is why I run 50-50 health, to have that safety net as well. It just makes sense. But that's it for Endurance. Charisma, we have 9 in total. First up we have Party Boy, to triple the effects of alcohol because I use whiskey. And with this card, whiskey gives us an extra 6 strength buff. I do have quite a stash of whiskey because I've got a buddy that makes it at his camp, so I'm good for that. But if you need to get your hands on some quickly, you can always serve a hot White Springs and grab all that Tannin has at the bar inside the resort. Field Surgeon, a very good synergising card to mainly help your stims work much quicker. This combined with First Aid and Born Survivor is what really increases your survivability. Strange in Numbers, to help increase the effects of all your mutations by 25% as long as you're on a team with others who are mutated, which is pretty much everyone. No brainer. And lastly, I use Tenderizer for an extra 10% multiplicative damage. By multiplicative, I mean it's 10% more of the overall damage you do, and not just from the base damage. Next, on to intelligence. First aid, that we mentioned a minute ago, stims restore 45% more health, and then max demolition expert to increase the damage of all the explosiveness. Next in agility, we have max action boy, for state the obvious, to increase all that lovely AP regen. Through hiker, because I carry a shit ton of whiskey and food etc, but this is mainly for if I'm carrying nukas for PvP. But that being said, I still like to use my nukas to be truly invincible in PvE as well.
I am invincible!
Because I'm a complete noob. But again, this is preference, so you may not need this, so you could save the cards and put them somewhere else if you like, or my recommendation would be to pump some points into adrenaline to increase damage output even further. And then lastly, Born Survivor. Running level 1 is the more logical option because we're running with 50% health, give or take, and if you drop to 20, you'll automatically use a stim. So you have that margin of 30% health, and then that as the safety net. And the beauty of this is that it refreshes every 20 seconds, so if you were to stand still and just take damage, pretty much by the time the stim has stopped working, due to the effects of first aid and field surgeon, it's refreshed again, so you really are invincible. Now for luck. Bloody Mess Max for an extra 15% damage. Class Freak is a must to reduce the negative effects of all the mutations. Starts Genes, again this is mandatory for mutation control so you don't lose any or contract any new ones. Grim Reaper, because this massively helps you keep your AP topped up with a huge 35% chance to restore all AP points. And then lastly, which is personal choice, good with Salt to keep all my food fresh. Simply saves me having to go farm it constantly, and it really is OP for keeping it fresh. But if I'm not running this, I would usually swap it out for 4-leaf clover to boost my chances of filling up my crits, just to be even more OP. With all of the above in mind, let's take a look at some alternative combos for different situations. So say I was running Bloodied, which I don't do very often due to certain detrimental caveats, but I would always make sure I have Life Giver. So I would take off Good with Salt and either Lead Belly or Solar Powered, take 2 points from Luck, put them in Agility, take off Born Survivor and bang on Dodgy. And with that 1 extra point, I put that back into Endurance for Life Giver. And my build would look something like this. But there's really no great need to run it Bloodied because all you really get from that is the Nerd Rage buffs. But it's a much greater risk versus no real reward for a couple of reasons. One, you need to use Dodgy, which kills your AP much quicker unless you're using Nukas. And 2, it's pretty detrimental to use Psycho buff when Bloodied because when it wears off, it can knock your health to nothing and leaves you pretty vulnerable to being one-tapped. And yeah, we could use Psycho Tats instead, but then you're missing out on all the beautiful buffs. On the other side of this, my PvP setup isn't hugely different. I would revert my HP back to 50-50 and keep my luck at 11 with the same cards. I would take 1 point from agility and pop that into endurance to max that out. And I would run the following cards: Lead Belly, Fireproof, Radicool, Life Giver, Chem Fiend 2 and Cola Nut 2. And that's why we have the Chem Fiend 2. But then agility, I would take out Action Boy because we're using Nukas, add Dodgy and Secret Agent, keep Through Hiker and Born Survivor, and Bob's your ante again. Now for the final part of the guide, which is the mutations and buffs. First we'll take a look at the base mutations, so what they look like with no team buff, and then what they look like with strange and numbers popping, and you can see the significant difference. Then all the buffs, including chems, food, and everything else. First up in the mutations, we have Adrenal Reaction. To boost damage, to lower your health, and since we run 50-50, you will get a boost from this. And despite the description reading plus weapon damage, this actually affects all damage. It's just a shit description. Bird Bones. For the increased agility, boost to max AP, and also works well with Marsupial to help with softer landings when you're hopping about like a maniac. Carnivore, which is one of the most important mutations to buff your build with food. As a carnivore, you get higher benefits from the foods available for a melee build, including strength food, melee damage, and other tanky foods, which we can take a look at later. Eagle Eyes. This is more of a personal preference for that additional crit damage, but isn't overly necessary as you do receive a debuff in strength as well, so this is where Class Freak is beneficial. Electrically Charged. As we're always up close and personal, we can take a lot of melee hits, so I like to run this because when it procs, it basically just hits anything nearby with an electric shot, which does a little damage and can help to stagger. And running this in tandem with Unstable Isotope, which basically does the same thing but with radiation instead, gives you a double chance essentially of proccing one of these effects. Next, Empath. Again, this is more of a personal choice and is mainly used for PvP, but this significantly reduces the amount of damage you take, but only if another member of the team has this mutation, as the effect is minus 25 team damage. So this is quite a big caveat, but I usually always have my alt on team because I've got two Xboxes, so this is a great benefit to me, but may not be the most ideal mutation for you, as the debuff actually makes you take slightly more damage if you don't have another empath on team. Grounded, which is a no-brainer because this boosts your energy resistance and the negative effect is doing less damage with energy weapons, which is great because we don't use weapons. Healing Factor, to auto-heal when not in combat, plain and simple, but the negative is that your chems don't work quite as effectively. But with Class Freak, we can absolutely live with minus 14% effectiveness. Herd Mentality. Another no-brainer, as this boosts your special points when on a team. Unless you never run on a team, which is just silly, you will lose 2 to all specials, so just be on a team. Simple. I have now noticed, however, that it no longer works when being on a public team on your own. This used to be a thing, so now just make sure that you're always on a team with others. Marsupial. Extra carry weight and that all-important jump height. I'm sure we all know about Marsupial. The debuff is minus intelligence, which isn't detrimental to the build at all. Plague Walker. Now, I'm sure we don't see this one very often, but this basically adds a poison aura to your character that does some area damage. Very similar to what the Strangler Power Armour does, which in turn synergizes and gives you that extra damage that you didn't know you could do. But on top of that, it also scales the more diseases you have, so it can become more powerful. Scaly Skin, simply to make you tankier, with increased damage and energy resistance. This comes with a small debuff to your max AP. Speed Demon, for faster movement speed, very important. The debuff is quite shite, as it increases your hunger and thirst by 50% while moving, but it's never that big an issue if you're like me and always keep on top of your food and water, which is quite important for your additional buffs and for your Overeater's armour as well. Talons, which again is quite an important mutation for the build, as it increases your unarmed damage by quite a significant amount and also adds bleed damage. Very OP for the old Iron Fists. The debuff is minus 1 agility, with Class Freak. Then lastly, Twisted Muscles, not overly required, but the debuff isn't detrimental, and in the event that you do want to use melee weapons, this will give you the same buff as your unarmed attacks, but also with a chance to cripple. And then lastly, we've already discussed Unstable Isotope, but yeah, basically does the same as Electrically Charged. So we've been through all the mutations while not on a team. Let's have a second look at how much they boost when I join a team and get that strange in numbers pumping for the extra 25% boost. Much better numbers. Awesome stuff. Now let's take a look at Chems and Aid. So for the Chems, these are now more straightforward than ever. As you can see from my addictions, I use alcohol, mentats and psycho products, but which ones? So first up, I like to use berry mentats, simply to highlight enemies, so while I'm running around, I can always see where they're at, but these aren't particularly necessary. And although there is absolutely no chem stacking anymore, the highlight effect from these still carries over, which is nice. But the main chem for the build is Psycho Buff, which is probably the most readily available and OP chem on the market for a melee build, for plus 25% damage, plus 3 strength for even more damage, plus 3 endurance for even more max HP, and another plus 65 max HP for 3 minutes. But remember, with Chem Fiend, these will last a lot longer. Now, when I mentioned about chem stacking a second ago, I also used to run Overdrive, because when we took an Overdrive and then a cycle buff, the crit damage buff from Overdrive would still carry over, as the cycle buff didn't override this. But now this doesn't work since one of the most recent updates, but somehow we can still have the highlight effect from berries. And this is the chems. Alongside these I use whiskey, hence the Party Boy Perk card, and with that we get plus 6 strength from whiskey. There are some other less effective alternatives like vodka and wine, etc, but if you can get your hands on a supply of whiskey, you're absolutely
Winning.
And for other buffs, I use Backwoodsman 6 to increase the benefits from my carnivore foods even further, unarmed bobbleheads for another 25% unarmed damage, I pump some iron for plus 2 strength, and have a blast on the speed bag for an extra 2 agility. Besides this, just always make sure you've got stims in your inventory for your Born Survivor, First Aid and Field Surgeon cards to do their jobs if necessary. That's us almost there, guys. Time for the very final section, food. I understand that not everyone is into food, nor fully understands the amazing benefits of running specific foods, but if you're not, I highly recommend it, especially for the likes of melee builds. Now, there are lots of different foods in the game, and there has been some changes to how some food works as of recent updates, but ultimately it can be very overwhelming. So let me break down the menu into just a few options. As a quick note as well, guys, it's very easy to find locations of things with a quick Google search, which normally links you to the Fallout fandom, whether it's to hunt down creature locations or find specific ingredients. So the food we primarily want to be focused on is food that increases your strength and melee damage, but there are also some other great foods to increase agility and overall tankiness as well. But first up, the main strength food is the easiest to grind and make, which is Deathclaw Steak. With Carnivore and Strange in Numbers, you get a buff of 5 strength, but with Backwoods 6 magazine, this boosts to 8. There are plenty of locations around the map where you can find Deathclaws, which can be easily server hopped. The upgrade to Deathclaw Steak is Deathclaw Wellington. Much harder to make, as it takes a lot more ingredients, as you can see, but this grants plus 8 strength with Strange in Numbers, and then plus 11 with Backwoods 6. But again, you can easily search where to find all the ingredients. Next, for melee damage. The easiest to find and make is either Glowing Meat Steak or Mutant Hound Chops for a base plus 40% damage, but increases to 100% with Strange in Numbers and up to 150% with Backwoods 6. The upgrade to these would be the tasty prepared versions, the easiest of which is Tasty Mutant Hound Stew for a base plus 85% damage, and with Strange in Numbers and Backwoods 6 increases to a whopping 311%. Other good foods you may want to consider are the ones that boost agility, max AP, endurance and max HP. The best way is to look through all your crafting recipes on the cooking bench and then go hunting for what you need. Lots of these amazing foods are also readily available in vendors, such as the vendor at Nuka World, Le Grand Gourmet, vendor in White Springs Mall, where you can also buy the recipes, and either Yasmin or Mall Allies, who both sell decent foods. So that's it for the build, guys. Hope you enjoyed that, hope you like the build, and I certainly hope it's inspiring. Make sure to hit that like button to help get it out there for others to see, and consider dropping a sub as the variety content is starting to heat up again. I'm also an established streamer over on Twitch now since becoming an affiliate, so feel free to follow me on there, links are in the description. But before we wrap this up, let's have one final look at the build and stats when I'm fully buffed and ready to go lay the smackdown on the wasteland. But thanks for watching, Tenacious out.